Hi everyone, this is lecture 10.1. In this lecture, we'll be talking about restorative justice and primarily focusing on the macro level. We will talk a little bit about the micro level, but the main focus here will be looking at the big picture efforts that have been made between nations toward restorative justice. So we'll talk about some basic definitions. We will give our macro level examples, and then we'll look at restorative justice models that can be used both on the micro and the macro level. So our society, we typically punish for 4 reasons, and you may remember this stuff from Social 101. So this is what the reasons why we either put people in prison or we punish people for different ways. First of all is incapacitation. We want to prevent the criminal from doing that given crime more. So we think if we put them in prison, they won't be able to do it anymore, at least to people on the outside. Deterrence. We want to discourage people from committing the crime again, or any people from committing the crime by making them afraid to go into prison. Retribution. We want to get justice or revenge for the victims. We don't often think of ourselves as a society that likes to seek out revenge, but when we start talking about murderers and rapists, we start using language like getting justice for the victim. Well, that is the language of revenge. And then rehabilitative. We want to help make the criminal a better person. That rehabilitative angle is something that is not really explored in great detail in the American criminal justice system. With those said, and these 4 reasons given, there is one reason the criminal justice system could occur, or there's one function the criminal justice system could do that our criminal justice system is severely lacking in, and we don't even attempt to do this. This is called restorative justice. Restorative justice is a criminal justice model that seeks to make both parties whole. So not only are we trying to help the victim, and we are trying to help the victim here, we are also trying to help the offender recover from whatever is happening in their life that drove them to committing that crime. Additionally, we may also be attempting to help the community rebuild, because from this perspective, if there is somebody in their community who is willing to do a crime, there might be something broken in the community that made that person be that way. This model can include complex storytelling, so telling narratives about the neighborhood or the community. It may include investigating the underlying causes of the crime, so we might very well be talking about the childhoods of both not only the victim but also the offender. And this can also include allowing the offender and the victim to confront the victim to confront the offender, or allowing them to connect on a personal level and talk about, hey, what happened that day, right? And obviously, a lot of emotions can be trudged up there. So it can be an emotionally difficult thing. Restorative justice models, it should be noted, can be applied on both the macro level and the micro level. On the micro level, a lot of those interactions and those incidents are highly individualistic. So there are almost nearly infinite numbers of ways that can go down. But on the macro level, and that's why I focused on this in this lecture, there have been dramatically fewer, but the macro level of this is impacting to, like, it's our collective history, to all our lives they impact. So let's talk about this macro level restorative justice stuff. So when you use these concepts on the extreme macro level, we focus on injustices committed by one group of people or nation against another group of people. Examples, and each of these will have their own slide. Examples on the macro level include the Holocaust, include apartheid in South Africa, include the treatment of the Aborigines in Australia, and this is a slight typo here, I was debating, can include the treatment of Native Americans in the United States, but could also include the treatment of people of African descent in the United States. Later on in this lecture, I actually focus on people of African descent because that's something we don't talk about restorative justice regarding Black people very often in our society. So I thought I would touch on that. So the Holocaust. During the reign of the Third Reich in Nazi Germany, the German state murdered over 8 million people, and 6 million of those people were Jewish. The other 2 million included LGBT people, people who were then classified as gypsies. If you're not familiar, the gypsies of Europe, the people often called gypsies, there's no real great name for the collective masses. They move around Europe in a transient kind of way, in temporary ways. A more politically correct name for them is the Roma, but not all gypsy people are Roma, so that's not actually super accurate either. It's a tough to talk about those groups of people accurately and not offending people. Anyway, though, Catholics were also killed in the Holocaust, and as were other enemies of the state. So communists were killed, dissenters, anyone effectively that questioned the Third Reich and the Nazi state. The word genocide itself did not exist until the trials of the Nazis after World War II. These trials, the Nuremberg trials, set precedents for holding military officers accountable for their actions during wartime. Prior to that, we did not. We had some concept of what was and was not a war crime. We in general did not put people on trial for things they did during war as an international community. These trials also started a series of reconciliation measures between the Jewish people and the German government that would dominate the political and social landscape of Germany since the end of World War II. We as Americans often still, when we think of Germans, sometimes we think of Nazis, right? And that is something that also the German people are very aware of. It has, since the 1940s, absolutely dominated their politics in terms of how can we keep this from ever happening again. And on the next slide, we're looking at that a little more detail. In 1951, a group called the Jewish Agency requested that the West German government compensate the State of Israel $1.5 billion in reparations as a result of crimes of the German government during World War II. Remember that in 1951, Germany was divided between East Germany and West Germany. So, but what was the West German government would eventually incorporate the East German government after the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of the Berlin Wall. Anyway, so in 2019 dollars, that $1.5 billion is nearly $15 billion. So to put it into perspective, that $1.5 billion is like, it's a massive amount of money. But in 1951, it was almost a inconceivable amount of money. And the West German government, because of their recognizing of what happened during World War II, was like, yes, we will pay that. But they did agree that to pay it, but they had to do it over time because it was just so much money. But over time, the price has been negotiated and renegotiated, both to account for European politics and other, politics of the world if you will. But to date, the German government has paid over $100 billion in reparations to parties tied to the Jewish people since the end of World War II. So this is a great story of reparations. The German government now, they acknowledge what happened. They want to prevent it from ever happening again. Their politics since World War II have been dominated by the Holocaust. But if you would say in Germany today that, oh, well, the Holocaust was a long time ago, it doesn't really matter, most German citizens would go, what are you talking about? That's ridiculous. The Holocaust was greatly traumatic to their society. Yes, and that's what it was. But it's about coming together and dealing with collective tragedy. That's really what restorative justice is. In South Africa, there was a system known as apartheid from 1948 to 1994. During the apartheid era, South Africa, in the state of South Africa, the country of South Africa, the population of that country was separated based on race. They were not only separated by businesses, but they were separate in terms of cities and territories within the nation. You could compare the apartheid government to segregation in the U.S. South during the segregation era, but it was a lot bigger than that. If you were a black person going into a white area, you had to show what effectively was a passport and say when you would be coming back. And basically all that stuff that goes with customs to deal with that every single day if, say, you're a maid in a different part of town. Additionally, within the apartheid system, even though white people were the dramatic minority numerically, they were only about 20% of the population. White people held the vast majority of wealth and power in South Africa. The population of blacks in South Africa were somewhere around 70%. Now, in 1994, the African National Congress, which is still is a political party, also known as the ANC, ended apartheid via peaceful democratic election. And in that election, the leader of the ANC, Nelson Mandela, became president of South Africa. Following the end of apartheid, the ANC and other groups created what was called the Peace and Reconciliation Commission. This was created in order to resolve the lingering issues caused by apartheid, because when you have a system that severe, that dominates your national everything, not just national dialogue, but national, like, the way everyone lives their lives, right? It was found that in order for South Africa to remain one country and not splinter into multiple countries, they had to do this kind of macro level restorative justice. They called it peace and reconciliation. The commission was most notable for its detailed trials and interviews. So I put trials / interviews because when you look at footage of these trials, they almost look like more of an interview than an interrogation. That's because the goal was both to compensate the victim for apartheid and also document what happened during apartheid, right? So they wanted to try to fix their society and help make people who were victimized, help make them whole again, but also really document how exactly it went down. And even if in those instances when no one could be held accountable for a given action, it was seen as positive, as a good thing to document the events that occurred within apartheid, so that and it's almost difficult for us to understand, even if nothing could be done about it, just to make sure that they knew that it happened, right? That was a justice in and of itself in the situation. It should also be noted that while most of the work of the commission was conducted during the 1990s, the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission continues to this day. It is it's an active part of the South African government into the modern era. Another group of people that were mistreated that worked in terms of restorative justice on a macro level was the relationship between Australia and the Aborigine people. The Aborigines are the native people of Australia. We're not super familiar with Aborigine people here in the United States. If you were just presented with pictures of them, they look of African descent, but they are their own distinct group of people. From about the time of the colonization of Australia by the British, the Aborigines were treated very, very badly by the Australian government. They were abused in many of the same ways that Native Americans were abused in the United States by the United States government. Most notably and most egregiously, the Aborigines were like Native Americans were taken from their families, and children were abducted and then re-educated to be more like the present white population. And Sari Day is a annual holiday, or it's an observance. It's not really a holiday. That every single year the Australian government apologizes for what happened, and they've been doing that since 1998. And it works off the premise that, just saying we are very sorry that this thing happened. It sounds kind of silly, but honestly, a lot of the way I have family that's Australian, a lot of the way that they phrase things just sound a little goofy to American ears. If you know Australian dialect and the way that they word things, calling something sorry day, that's something they would call it. Let's talk about the United States. Let's talk about slavery. As Americans, we are very familiar with the fact that Africans were used as slaves in the first part of our nation's history. And this fact is so big in our history. It's so big and it's so present that it is often tempting to ignore it altogether. At multiple points in our history, the argument has been made that African Americans are due reparations due to this historic injustice. Reparations would be payment made by a guilty party to attempt to help their victims recover. After the end of slavery, after the end of the Civil War, slaves were just let go, right? They had next to nothing, right, of their own. In terms of modern justice, the arguments are very good that those initial slaves absolutely were owed something. And let's go to the next slide. And there are those that argue that the United States government still is responsible to all African Americans who could trace their ancestry back to slavery, and that those people should be compensated. And this would represent millions of people, right? This would be African American population in the United States is about 12%. If you were being really ruthless about it, that means that at least 10% of the American population would be owed reparations in one way or another due to the ramifications of slavery. One of the original reparations proposed was from Union General William Tecumseh William Tecumseh. He proposed that all African Americans, and in that instance, in that sexist era, they meant all families. So every man, basically, because the man, the head of the household, that whole concept. that they all be given 40 acres and a mule. That sounds kind of arbitrary, doesn't really make any sense in the modern era. You have to understand 40 acres of land and a mule, that represents what somebody could use who grew up farming like slaves did, right? They were used as agricultural workers. And the mule was a relatively inexpensive but very valuable tool needed to do that farming. So, with 40 acres and a mule, a family could support themselves. They could live a life. And that's what he proposed, that we give all slaves in reparations for what we did to them collectively. In the modern era, that would translate to costing at least $6.4 trillion. And that would mean that every slave descendant in our country, again, if you're being really conservative about it, 10% of the US population would be owed at least $500,000 by the US government. So that really, putting it in those contexts, it makes the scope of it come into play, right? We say, well, if we paid that out to all of the people who have slave ancestry, then we would go bankrupt. Well, maybe we would, or maybe we would have to reconsider a lot of the things that we spend a lot of money on in society. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about general restorative justice models. Again, ones that hadn't been talked to on the macro level. Restorative justice procedures are not only useful on the macro level, but they can also be applied to the micro level, so that interpersonal level. If anything, actually, these justice models are easier on the micro level because we're dealing with fewer people, so it's easier to adapt. But that does not mean that they're not emotionally difficult. And a big part of that is because they involved direct confrontation with people who have hurt you very badly. Now, for the sake of time, I'm not going over each of these four major restorative justice models. They can be found on page 249 of your text, but for the sake of listing them and just showing them you where they are, on page 249 you can learn more about victim-offender mediation, family group conferencing, community reparative boards, and also peacemaking circles. I do believe in the next couple slides I am also going to be touching on what exactly peacemaking circles are, because they're so I like to really address things that are very different than the way our society does things. I think that's a very valuable way to learn. So macro level restorative justice requires a very careful balance between rehabilitating the offender and victims' rights, right? So it's really easy to be in favor of rehabilitating criminals when you are talking about the grand philosophical scale, right? And what is justice, and how do we make the world a better place? But when you take specific instances into account, when you start talking about people who have raped people and people who have murdered people, it brings into stark contrast that maybe the victims of crimes are owed that the offender isn't given all that rehabilitation, right? It's a very, very careful balance that must be made. What restorative justice models would argue that we owe it to our communities to try to make all parties, including that offender, whole in the best way possible. I don't know if I read that out. The victim rights movement is a modern movement that attempts to make the victim whole as opposed to simply punishing the criminal by the government. That's a really pretty good point there. There are crimes where the offender has been punished, but still the victim of the actual crime is still left in tatters, when maybe some of the fines or some of the effort paid toward punishing the offender could have been used to helping the actual victim. Community justice is a goal of all variants of crime prevention and justice activities. And community justice explicitly include the community in the process and set enhancement of community quality of life as a goal. So community justice is a different way of law enforcement. Many law enforcement models encourage officers to see people who are not police as being the enemy. The phrase "the thin blue line" is sometimes used. That can be interpreted to mean that there's only the police keeping everything from falling apart. And that kind of mindset can cause some police officers to see everyone who isn't a police officer, therefore, as being an enemy. What community justice wants to do is better integrate police forces into communities so that everyone works together to keep everyone safe, not just police, but everyone. Community justice requires what are called active agents. Active agent models encourage partnership between traditional justice entities, so the police, and members of the community. So what a active agent model wants is for people in the community to cooperate with the police and feel comfortable with cooperating with the police because they know that the police are actually on their side. If you know anything about police brutality issues, you know anything about conflicts between police and civilians, you know that that can be intensely difficult because of history. Active agent approaches require taking a problem-solving approach to enhancing public safety. It requires building capacity within the community. What does that mean? We're talking about building relationships between officers and people in the community. It requires evaluation based on community outcomes. So we're not just evaluating the effectiveness of a police force based on how many people are arrested. We're basing it based on how effective the schools are, or how safe people feel in their community compared to 10 years ago, stuff like that. And it also requires a restorative justice as an orientation. So we are not just looking to lock people up, we are looking to make the entire community, including the offender, we're whole people again. In this slide and the next slide, we're looking at two alternative methods toward restorative justice. One of those is a sentencing circle. A sentencing circle is a judicial method originally developed by the First Nations people of Canada. In Canada, instead of calling them Native Americans, they call them First Nations people. This sentencing circle, we have people literally sitting in a circle, and it is dialogue based. It includes not only the victim and the offender, so both sides get to tell their story, but also any family members that might be involved, any other community members that might be involved, to telling the story and coming to a conclusion that could try to make everyone whole in a given conflict. The goal of sentencing circles are not to punish the offender. The goal is to repair the damage that was done to the community and the offender and the victim that was done by the crime. So the goal of a sentencing circle is not to punish anybody, but to repair the damage done by the community. If that means making the offender do something for the community, it could involve that too, but that would also require the offender to agree with that and go along with that. Victim Offender Reconciliation Program, also known as VORP, is something that has another alternative method that has been developed by Mennonite communities. So it's a faith-based program that works with victims, works with prisoners, and works with prisons to try to work toward forgiveness between the offender and the victim, and trying to find ways to rehabilitate the offender. This program is really based on Mennonite beliefs and ideologies. If you're not familiar with Mennonites, they are a Christian denomination known for their dedication to nonviolence and extreme forgiveness. And Mennonites often oppose prison on the grounds that the institution is inherently violent. Mennonites are noted for being pacifists. Mennonites have never endorsed any war that the United States has been involved in, and I believe they do. They don't have to pay taxes that will go toward wartime as part of their religion. And so it should also, some Mennonite communities do dress similar to the Amish, these people down here below, but different Mennonites and Amish, they do have similar beliefs, but they are different. And these people up here in more modern dress, these people are Mennonites too. So all kinds of different Mennonites. Yeah, that's what we got for this time's lecture. And if you have any questions about these concepts, please let me know. And in our work this week, we will be exploring ideas around restorative justice. See you later.